Good morning and welcome to the Killik & Co Market Update. This week, Disney has launched its long-awaited streaming service, Disney+. Now, back in 2017, Disney pulled all of its own content off of Netflix with a view to setting up a specific Disney streaming service specifically for Disney's original content, including the Marvel films, Star Wars, and also all the content that Disney has acquired as part of its acquisition of Fox. So this launch of the so-called Disney+ streaming service has been quite highly anticipated, and ahead of the launch this week, I think the consensus was that between 5 and 7 million people would sign up in week one. However, the service has far exceeded those expectations, with over 10 million people signing up in the first week. So very strong numbers here, and this does present a real challenge to Netflix. And in fact, we have seen a decline in the share price of Netflix this week. So as I said, 10 million people signing up to Disney Plus in week one. To put that into context, at the moment, Netflix has a total of 158 million subscribers. So actually, after just 1 week, Disney has made quite a lot of headway against Netflix. And I think the question here, looking longer term, is just how many individual streaming services people would be willing to sign up to. The competition really is heating up, with Apple having joined the party as well. Now consumers have lots of options to pick from. They've got Disney, they've got Netflix, they've got Apple, they've got Amazon, and the question is really how many of those are they going to sign up to long term. So over the coming weeks, we will be keeping a close eye on these Disney Plus subscription numbers and looking at the challenge that will present to Netflix over the longer term. We talked about the protests in Hong Kong a couple of weeks ago, and we talked about the problems these are causing for companies that operate in the region. This week we've had further evidence that the protests are not only not slowing down, they're actually becoming increasingly violent. And we've had further evidence this week from Burberry that the protests really are starting to cause more problems for companies operating in the region. So Burberry published results this week, and although results were strong, there was a specific comment in there about the problems caused by the protest in Hong Kong. So here's a quote from the finance director of Burberry. They said that we have seen a significant decline in Hong Kong across the half, and especially in the second quarter, largely driven by a fall in the number of Chinese visitors. And in fact, Burberry has said it has had to close a number of its stores in the area over concerns for staff safety. So Burberry, I think, is quite lucky in that not a huge proportion of its overall profits come from Hong Kong. However, there are a number of other companies who are much more highly dependent on Hong Kong, and the problems are much more concerning for them. And HSBC has to be an example here. HSBC depends on Hong Kong for over 50% of its profits, so any further ongoing protests in the area have got to be a concern for this company longer term. And finally, this week, the largest processor of milk in the US, a company called Dean Foods, has filed for bankruptcy. Now, the company gave a number of reasons for this, partly the increasing levels of competition, the downward pressure on prices, and also perhaps the fact that people are switching away from dairy towards milk alternatives such as soy milk and almond milk. And also we have had an increase in the number of people who believe they are lactose intolerant. When we were looking at the data for the global milk market, we actually found quite an interesting trend. So if you have a look at this chart here from the Financial Times, you can see that the consumption of milk per person in the US has actually declined by 40% since the 1970s. And what this actually shows is that we really do have an aging population in the US. So if you consider that the birth rate in the US has been fairly constant since the 1970s, and yet the overall population is increasing. So that shows us that people in the US are living for longer. Now, we know that children do drink a higher proportion of milk. Therefore, because the overall population in the US is becoming older, the amount of milk drunk per person has actually declined over the last few years. So this just highlights to us that to focus as an investment theme on the aging population in the world is still the correct thing to be focusing on. Now, moving on to the week ahead, clearly we're still focusing on the general election, and in fact this morning the Labour Party has announced that if they were to be elected, they would plan to nationalise BT in order to offer free broadband to everyone in the UK. And this comes on top of their plans to nationalise UK water utilities and also UK power networks. So this really does demonstrate just how widespread this party's plans for nationalising the UK have become. And there have been lots of arguments in the press this week between the Conservatives Conservatives and the Labour Party over the exact costs of Labour's proposed nationalisation plan. So that is something we'll be following quite closely over the coming days. In terms of companies reporting next week, it's looking fairly quiet, but we have got results out from medical devices company Medtronic and also the owner of TK Maxx, TJX. That's it from us. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next Friday.